Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of A.IdlePodcast, the podcast where I do weekly book reviews. This week, I read The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. Released in 1963, this is an unfiltered view of Black consciousness in America. It can also be seen as a coming-of-age piece, as it discusses the moral and personal battles that Baldwin had as a young child. However, there is an added layer of a very necessary conversation on race relations, which gives us somewhat surprising viewpoints that aren't always discussed. Now, keep in mind, being that this was released in the 60s, we're in the hot streak of the civil rights movement. This is when a lot of figures started gaining traction, including Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. So there is reference to these figures as well as other groups that were crucial in the turn of the civil rights movement. This is also 100 years post-Emancipation Proclamation, which was when the enslaved people were freed in America. And so to put that into perspective, we're referencing and discussing another very crucial moment of civil unrest in America, the Civil War, which was another battle of ideologies. So there's a lot of parallels going on here. Before we jump into the content, being that this is structured slightly differently than a lot of other books, I wanted to touch on the two segments of the book. So the first segment is titled My Dungeon Shook, Letter to My Nephew on the 100th Anniversary of the Emancipation. So that is exactly what it sounds like. It takes up maybe 10% of the book, and it is a letter to his nephew, which is expressing concern for his character going forward. The second segment is Down at the Cross, Letter from a Region in My Mind, which again is very, very accurately titled. It is a letter that it seems like we're able to peer into the soul of James Baldwin. So what you're going to see in this book is essentially an essay that Baldwin wrote and released for all of us. There aren't any chapters other than those two segments. It's not really broken up much. It's just a extended piece of writing on race relations in America. And it's about 100 pages or so, and it's a true 100 pages. There's no page breaks. Again, there's no chapters. There's not really, the paragraphs are very long, so it's not like it's separated by short paragraphs either. So all right, so the tone of the book, therefore, is super vulnerable and raw. This is because his thoughts are without structure or editing. If you told me that he wrote this book, this piece, in half an hour and didn't edit it and kind of released it for the world to see, I would totally believe you. And that's not a comment on the content either, because unlike most people, Baldwin is clearly skilled in writing and transforming his thoughts to words on a paper. And so he's someone that doesn't need, the use of editing. Whereas even with me, with writing this outline, I made 20 different edits. So it's something that comes straight from the heart, and you can really view it as an inner monologue. And throughout the book, there were certain sections that if I didn't comprehended well enough, I would read it out loud and it suddenly made sense. So you can see it as an essay, as a speech, but it's definitely not your typical book or discussion on racism. Now, in addition to it being very real, it's also unapologetic. And this is because his pride shows through his ability to express his unrest. There are people that are suffering in the world for various reasons. And I think what adds on to the suffering is the inability to express what you're feeling or how a situation makes you feel. Whereas, again, Baldwin is a skilled writer, and so he's able to let us into his consciousness, which reflects a lot of Black people's thoughts during this time period and going forward, honestly. So, in that sense, it's unapologetic. I don't know why I can't say that word today. But I don't want anyone to be fooled. This is not a biased piece. It's very factual. You can't refute his experiences, and everything that he's writing about is something that happened to him, events that he went through in his childhood, or the people that he met in his adulthood. So it's not biased, but these are his experiences. But his opinion is clear, but he's not also blindly believing just anything. And one example of this is his stance on the Nation of Islam and their stance with race. And we're going to talk about that in just a few moments. But, that's just one example of him not just throwing something in your face for the sake of, providing a solution. The two literary devices that I pulled from this book are symbolism, of course, and quote. Now, quote is important because the title, "The Fire Next Time," is in reference to the following quote. God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, the fire next time. And this is actually lyrics to a song by an enslaved person. And for whatever reason, I thought it was a quote from the Bible. And so I was Googling it, but it's a song by someone who was in slavery, and it opens and closes the book. When we talk about the fire, that symbolizes the destruction of America or a particularly destructive event. And it's kind of a covert explanation because it's never really stated outright what Baldwin thinks the fire is, but it's inferred that the destruction of America will lay within unresolved race relations. And that's not, a far-fetched comment by any means. Secondly, we see that religion really symbolizes power. And this is an over-explanation. So this is explained through the interactions that Baldwin has with Christianity and the Nation of Islam. Essentially, history shows that powerful societies are backed by religion. And religion is actually one of the themes, so I don't want to go too far into it just yet, but in a few seconds we'll get there. So the first theme I want to discuss is fear, and that's because we encounter this very early on in the piece when Baldwin is talking about his decisions as a child and how he managed to navigate to the person that, he was in that present moment. So fear is the motivating factor in many of the decisions that he made. And it was in an effort to be a better person, whatever that, means to whoever. But there were a few things that he was afraid of. One being the streets and, the life of crime. One being hell. And then another being white supremacy. And in the first portion of this piece, the letter to his nephew, he's essentially encouraging him not to be scared, not to be afraid, and not to go out into the world letting fear dictate your next move. And I think there's a lesson in that we all can learn, that you really shouldn't be relying on fear as the factor to make your decisions. It's not that you'll perpetually make bad decisions because of fear, but it's just, you don't want to look back and say that, oh, what made me decide to jump into this profession? Oh, because I was afraid of being poor. Like that's a sure way to create resentment. But as far as just, finding peace and happiness, that's not really the way to go. You have to confront them. So The second theme here I want to touch on is self-worth. So this is also heavily touched on in the first piece with the letter to the nephew. I think he wants to instill a sense of self and pride in his nephew, and just recognizing that there is value to being himself and standing in that. One quote that a little bit later on into the book that really hit me was when Baldwin said, "The person who distrusts himself has no touchstone for reality, for this touchstone can be only yourself, or only oneself." And what this is essentially saying is that if you can't really come to terms with you, then you can't see the world clearly, because you don't even trust yourself. And so there is value in coming to terms with who you are as a person and living in that, because then you're able to navigate the world a little bit better. Now, we always look back on the ancestors of Black people, whether they were enslaved, whether they were the people that were living in the midst of Jim Crow, with almost a tint of pity. But Baldwin reminds us that the Black people who had to yes ma'am themselves into better positions in life, they did that for the betterment of future generations. For example, he talks about, the Black people that had to kind of endure that humiliation to build better schools, or to get loans to, put a better roof over the school, or get, better textbooks and things like that. They ultimately produced the generation of Black kids that had the strength to walk through mobs to integrate the schools. So there's worth in that as well. And you can find worth in yourself as a Black person, knowing that you're now, kind of carrying that success. But I think that's an important comment on self-worth, because of course we can never know what, those people were thinking. But understanding that they had a enormous task to take on, which was humiliation, in order to, provide for their community, there's worth in that. And I don't think that those people had pity for themselves. So that it was just an interesting conversation that I had never really looked at it like that before. And I'm definitely guilty of kind of looking at, Black people in the past with kind of like, oh my gosh, I feel so bad for them. But they were very strong. They provided strength, and they provided a great foundation for the Black people of today. But also, we're not done yet. Like there's still some strides we have to make. So I want to make that clear. Like we're not in the clear yet, but they definitely provided a lot for us to thrive as we are right now. Okay, so now we get to the theme of religion and race. So we're talking about the two religions that Baldwin discusses in this piece, which are Christianity and the Nation of Islam, both of which he has had personal encounters with. So Christianity was actually something that was in his home. His father was a pastor, and he ultimately became a pastor at 14 in an effort to escape, the streets. And he was given authority over people's faith. He was giving sermons every week, encouraging people to, look towards God and kind of place their trust there and give up their money and, for collections. And he saw the behind the scenes stuff of that, which included that money not necessarily going to godly things and going into people's pockets. And I think this is where he lost a lot of his faith in Christianity, just being able to see the backside of all of that. And he later describes it as being morally bankrupt and politically unstable. He also, when we're talking about Christianity versus the Nation of Islam, he uses white God and black God to kind of differentiate which God he's talking about. Which is true, because in Christianity, the picture that you get of God is white, and in the Nation of Islam it is black. So he's not making up things here, but he does use that term a lot to talk about who he's referring to in the situation. He does state a little bit, like halfway into the book, in the realm of morals, the role of Christianity has been at best ambivalent. This is a comment on Christianity and its relationship to racism. Now, this is a discussion that I think has been brought up a fair amount of times when we're looking at, if God made the world, the way he wanted it, then why are Black people enduring suffering year after year after year after year? And being told that, okay, well, God wants it that way, you kind of have to reconcile that with, you're supposed to go through suffering. And that's a really hard pill to swallow. And a lot of people are choosing not to swallow it at this point. But it leads way to the conversation on the sons of Ham. So I have not read most of the Bible, but I have heard of this before. And it's called the Curse of Ham. And it's from the book of Genesis. And Noah is the one who put the curse on Black people, supposedly, which essentially means that inferiority is inherently owned by Black people. So that means that if God wants it that way, it's in the Bible, then Black people are inferior, period, which gives justification for white supremacists to uphold, a corrupt society. But it also enforces, of course, that white people are superior. And so for Black Christians, this is difficult to wrap your mind around. And this is where, even since slavery, slaves being told that it's in the Bible that you're supposed to be a slave, it breaks down your self-worth, essentially. And it strips you of any freedom to determine your fate by saying that this is what was meant for you and this is what you're going to get. Which we see, especially in the 50s and the 60s, we see a turn of Black people towards the Nation of Islam. Now, it's interesting how Baldwin kind of started paying attention to the Nation of Islam, because he said their ideologies wasn't anything new and he was exposed to it before. But when he recognized that the members of the Nation of Islam, when they were giving speeches out on the street, the reaction was different from people. Black people, in his words, seemed jolted, whereas it wasn't like they were being coerced into listening. And the authoritative figures around, mainly being the police, almost seemed scared. And so this really brought him in to see, okay, what are they talking about? What's going on here? Why are people so fearful? And why are Black people so, it almost seems like they're given their backbones back a little bit. And as he started learning more and more about what the Nation of Islam was doing, he recognized that that's what Christianity should be doing for people. They should be keeping people out of jail and off of drugs and caring for people, and not instilling this sense of fear from hell, just really being an empowering force. And again, this is where he uses the term the Black God a lot. But as we see, Baldwin reflects on an interaction that he had with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and how he didn't necessarily agree with everything that they were saying, but he had a very high level of respect. And he was trying to wrap his head around what they were saying. Ultimately, in the end, was a push for a separate Black economy. And that was, going to be one of the bricks laid in the path to success for Black people in America. And this leads us to the last theme discussed, which is integration. Now, keep in mind, we're in the 60s, more importantly, 63. And there was a push from the liberal side of America, but also from Black activists for integration. But it's important to note that not every Black person wanted integration, which is something that I don't think is talked about enough in historical pieces from that time period, but Baldwin does touch on it. So the goal of the Nation of Islam, again, was to almost create a separate space for Black Americans, and seeing this as the only way for Black people to really thrive. A quote towards the very end of the book from Baldwin says, "Do I really want to be integrated into a burning house?" And so they ultimately see America as being doomed, and this is the fire that we're talking about, to a destructive end. And so we need to kind of gather the people that really believe and kind of get our society together before America completely goes to shit. Now, I'm trying to get my thoughts together, because this is I don't want to keep using the term interesting, but I do not see this talked about a lot when we're referencing the civil rights movement. It's always seen as, okay, all Black people wanted to get together, and if you were against integration, then you were bad. But there's opinions and there's movements that counter that even though, they didn't win out in the end, we have to talk about it. And so another argument kind of for resisting integration was the idea that equality means bringing Black people up to the level of white people, which enforces the view that white people are more valuable and superior. And so now we're talking about, when you look at that argument, we're talking about the irony of separate but equal. So in this case, the people that really do not or did not want to be integrated, they just want their own and leave it at that. Because we are equal as people. No one's higher or lower than anyone else. We're people, that's it. But just give us our separate space and let it be done. Now, in theory, that sounds great, but in practice, that wasn't happening, and that's why it was outlawed. So there's this whole conversation on, is that really possible to implement a society that is separated, which I guess would really just end up being two completely different nations, and leave it at that. But that's an interesting conversation from mainly, I would say, the Nation of Islam, but also James Baldwin was inputting a lot of ideas as well. But when you talk about implementing this oasis for Black people, you're talking about a completely separate economy, completely separate everything. And it's interesting how he was saying to one of the members that he doesn't oppose it, but how would they do it? How would you do that? Because you're completely removing yourself from everything that you've known. So I really enjoyed Baldwin's transparency when it came to discussing these events and not classifying if you're for or against integration as good or bad, but looking at all of the sides and what is best for America, what is best for Black America, and let's go from there. So, my review, I think that this really showcased Baldwin's writing capabilities in its purest form. It was straight from the heart. Again, I really don't feel like it was edited. I feel like he just sat down and wrote, and this was, the result. There's a call to action at the end, and it's collective. It's not mainly for Black people or for white people. And really what he's saying is everyone needs to get their shit together in order to save this nation. Now, obviously that varies by position, of course, what your responsibilities in that are, but we really need to get it together. And it's interesting that this was released in 1963. We are in 2021 and we still need to get our shit together. And that's the funny thing about this book. It's dated in terms of references when he's talking about things like integration, when, looking back, we know that's going to happen. But a lot of what he's saying can be applied to today as well. Even his commentary on listening to political figures and how people just eat it up regardless of what side you may think you're on. People kind of just accept that. Just little comments like that, it's going to help position this book as one of the greatest pieces ever written. And it's a definite reread, but it definitely preserves a particular part of American history for all future generations. So this is something I think everyone needs to read. I don't think everyone is ready to read it yet, because in order to get to the end of the book with that call to action to everyone, you have to read through the commentary on race and how Black people are positioned in America, how they were positioned in America, the conversation on fear and religion, in order to get to that point. But I do think it's worth it. Again, it's 100 pages. It's not difficult to read. I lost time reading it. I would say, oh, I'll just, read 10, 15 pages, put it down, think on it. But I ended up reading straight through. And anytime I got caught up, I just read it out loud. And I felt like he was speaking to me. These are his words. But it's amazing. He's an excellent writer, and I think that we can all learn from his story, but also from his ability to express his opinions. So 2 takeaways for the 2 parts. With the first part, you really shouldn't limit your capabilities ever. You're valuable and you are set to accomplish, great things, but don't limit your capabilities due to fear. And second, there is value in understanding America's legacy. So don't shy away from, the difficult parts of the conversation. Understand the history so that we can all, move forward into the future. So thank you all so much for tuning in to another episode. With the holidays approaching, I just want to say I am thankful for those that listen to me and or watch. It's only a few people for right now, but I have a feeling we're going to blow up soon. But I'm really thankful for you all. I'm thankful to have the ability to even do this and read these books and talk about it. And yeah, it's just an amazing thing. I hope everyone's enjoying their time off work if they have it, or their break from school, and I will see you all next week. Thank you.